Come join me on my second channel, Jaguar Gator 8, where we'll talk all things college football. New video drops every Monday at 6 p.m. Eastern. Click the card in the upper right corner to watch the latest video. And now, on with our feature presentation. During a lot of broadcasts, the announcers will have somewhat of a filter. I'm not saying they don't express their true thoughts on the situation, but often you'll see broadcasters trying to avoid criticism at all costs. Broadcasters are meant to provide an insight as to what is going on and to help viewers understand the game. But at the same time, they're also meant to promote the NFL and promote its product. It's very rare to see a broadcaster in today's game say that a referee is awful, say that a coach needs to be fired, or that a player needs to be benched, needs to be fined, and is dogging it and is intentionally trying to play terribly. Yet in 1979, that's exactly what happened. And man, did it cause a giant uproar and controversy. During the 1979 season, the Cincinnati Bengals took on the Dallas Cowboys. And there was one play that happened in the fourth quarter of the game that made announcers Sam Nover and Bob Trumpy speak their minds about the effort, or lack thereof, given by one player on the Bengals. The aftermath was brutal, with the players, the head coach, and the organization calling the announcers out, and with an already bad Bengals team having to deal with yet another firestorm. This is the story behind the craziest broadcasting controversy involving NBC and the Cincinnati Bengals. Before I talk about the controversy in question, we need some context to understand the player in question, how the game and the season for that matter was going, and the prior feud that the player in question had with the announcer. In 1973, the Cincinnati Bengals decided that they needed to bolster up their passing game. Only one player on the team in 1972 had more than 500 yards receiving, and Chip Myers led the team in receiving touchdowns with a grand total of 3. The top player on the Bengals in receiving touchdowns ranked 37th in a 2016 league. For some perspective, 3 players on the Oakland Raiders had more receiving touchdowns than the top guy on the Bengals. With that, they spent their first round pick, which was number 15 overall, on San Diego State wide receiver Isaac Curtis. And I think it's safe to say that Curtis helped fix that issue, because Curtis was an absolutely dominant wide receiver who immediately came onto the scene as one of the league's best. As a rookie in 1973, he made the Pro Bowl by having 9 touchdowns and 843 yards, ranking inside the top 5 in the NFL in receiving yards, receiving touchdowns, and yards per reception. He was a top vote-getter in the AFC for Offensive Rookie of the Year, and came in 3rd place overall, controversially losing out to fullback Chuck Foreman of the Minnesota Vikings. As a side note, if you want to learn more about the career of Chuck Foreman, click the card in the upper right corner. He followed that up in 1974 with another Pro Bowl season where he had 10 touchdowns, ranking 2nd in the NFL, only behind Oakland Raiders wide receiver Cliff Branch, and his strong play made him a second-team All-Pro for the first time ever. In 1975, he received another Pro Bowl nomination and another second-team All-Pro nomination, and led the NFL with 21.2 yards per catch, becoming the first and to date only player in Bengals history to ever lead the league in this category. And in 1976, he once again was named a Pro Bowler and was named a second-team All-Pro. Through Isaac Curtis's first 4 seasons, he was having about as great of a start to his career as possible. After 4 seasons, he already tied the franchise record for most Pro Bowls or All-Star games made, tying Bob Trumpy's record, who made it to 4 with the team in 1968, 69, 1970, and 1973. The name Bob Trumpy will play a big part in our story later on, so just keep that thought and that name in the back of your mind. Curtis had 160 receptions for 3,176 yards and 32 touchdowns. Only one other player in the NFL over that 4-year stretch had more receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns, and that was the eventual Hall of Famer Cliff Branch. You could make the legitimate argument that outside of Branch, there was no receiver in football during the mid-70s that was better than Isaac Curtis. He was that good, but not all good things can last forever, because by 1979, it seemed like everything involving him and the team had completely soured. I'm not sure anyone knew what to expect of the Cincinnati Bengals entering the 1979 season. On one hand, they were terrible in 1978, going 4-12 and finishing dead last in not just the AFC Central as the only team with a below 500 record, but dead last in the AFC, tied with the Kansas City Chiefs for the worst record in the conference. On the other hand, this was their first losing season since 1971. They still had one of the greatest quarterbacks in the game in Ken Anderson. They had the 5th best defense in the conference from a points allowed standpoint. They ended the season on a 3-game winning streak, and over the second half of the season, actually had a positive point differential at plus 48. How many teams can go 4-12 the year before and be listed at 25-1 odds in 1979 to win the Super Bowl? For some perspective, they were given the same odds to win the Super Bowl as the Houston Oilers, the team that in 1978 made it to the AFC Championship. I guess the word people used to describe the Bengals going into 1979 was cautious optimism. That did not happen. Over the first 4 games of the season, the Bengals were a complete mess, as they started the year 0-4 and already looked dead in the water before the end of September. They started the year off with an embarrassing 10-0 shutout loss to the Denver Broncos, which was odd because the Bengals never turned the ball over. How many times do you see a team getting shut out without turning it over? That's how inept they were at moving the football. Then they followed that up with a 51-24 loss to the Buffalo Bills. To show how embarrassing it was to allow the Bills to score 51 points on you, they only scored 7 the week before against the Miami Dolphins, and that was on a blocked field goal return, so it wasn't even on offense. They picked up 5 first downs and 121 yards of total offense in that game, and managed a mere 1.8 yards per carry. And yet the following week against Cincinnati, they put up 51, with Roland Hooks, a man who had been in the NFL since 1975 and had scored 3 touchdowns in his entire career, scoring 4 in the second half alone. They then followed that up with a 20-14 loss to the New England Patriots in their home opener, and followed that up with a 30-27 loss in overtime against their division rival, the Houston Oilers. That game was particularly embarrassing because the Bengals had a 24-0 lead at one point, which was 4 possessions back in 1979 since the 2-point conversion did not exist. And yet, the Oilers came back from the dead. And if being 0-4 wasn't bad enough, there were not 1, but 2 teams in the division with a 4-0 record, and the other team was the 3-1 Oilers, so they were already out of the division title hunt, and we weren't even in the month of October yet. Fortunately, they had a pretty easy opponent coming up in Week 5 to try and right the ship. And by pretty easy, I mean insanely difficult. Going on the road and going up against the 3-1 Dallas Cowboys, as in the same Cowboys team that made it to each of the last 2 Super Bowls, and had won 13 of their last 14 home games, including the playoffs dating back to the middle of the 1978 season, seemed like an incredibly daunting task. If the Bengals were going to have any chance of winning this game, they needed Isaac Curtis to play well and have a big performance. But unfortunately, the 1979 season had not been kind to him both on and off the field. Entering the 1979 season, it seemed like Isaac Curtis was on the decline. After 4 straight Pro Bowl seasons to kick off his career, he became the victim of a pretty nasty injury on November 6, 1977 against the Cleveland Browns. He had arguably his best game of the season, as in a 10-7 victory, he had a season-high 5 receptions for 70 yards. But that's not what he remembers this game for, because he suffered a nasty knee injury and had to miss the rest of the season. And in 1978, even though he was cleared to play and wound up playing all 16 games, he was not going at 100%, and caught just 3 touchdown passes, which was a far cry from the 8 touchdowns a year he was averaging over his first 4 seasons. And remember that those first 4 years were in a 14-game season, while 1978 was a 16-game season, so this was even worse. As Curtis said on that season, "I played on one leg last year. It takes a good year to get comfortable after something like surgery. Last year, all I wanted to do was get through the season." In fact, he was so hobbled with injuries and looked so beaten up that when he arrived in Denver, the desk clerk at the team hotel was not even convinced that he was on the team. You have the injury history. You have the contract problem, which was really bad during the offseason, as the Bengals and Curtis were supposedly so far apart from each other that their positions were the equivalent of the distance between New York and California. You had a supposed attitude problem, where because Curtis was so fed up with his contract situation, there were allegations of him declining to do some workouts and running at half speed in others, threatening the team to either sign him or else he would sit out. And you had a rough start to the season, not just for the team, but for Curtis as well. Through the first 4 games in 1979, Curtis had 2 receptions for 23 yards and no touchdowns, which if extrapolated to a full 16-game season, comes out to 8 receptions for 98 yards. That's pathetic by anyone's standards, let alone the standards of the great Isaac Curtis. And I bring all this up because during the offseason, there was a major feud involving him and Bob Trumpy, the former tight end who is now a color commentator for NBC. Trumpy accused Curtis of being lazy and dogging it, and said that the Bengals had 2 or 3 receivers at this moment who were better than Curtis. As Trumpy would later say, he did little in training camp. He is unsigned. He wants to play elsewhere. Add it all up, and he may be hurting the football team. That's only common sense. If that's my way of thinking, then that's what I'm going to say. This led Curtis to fire back, saying, "Of all the broadcasting people, Trumpy should have been the one to understand my problem here. I thought he was a bigger man than that. Obviously, he just wanted to stir up some controversy on TV, and he decided to pick on me." The 2 men supposedly made up after Trumpy called him to tell him that his comments were taken out of context, and that the only way the Bengals were going to succeed is if Curtis could catch 8 to 10 passes a game. However, any goodwill between the 2 men and former teammates was completely gone 1 month later. Because what happens when you have a struggling Isaac Curtis playing a game against America's team called by Bob Trumpy himself? Well, as we're about to find out, you have a giant controversy that rocked the football world. September 30th, 1979. It's week 5 of the NFL season, and we're down in Texas for this interconference battle between the Cincinnati Bengals and the Dallas Cowboys in what was a must-win game for the Bengals under almost improbable circumstances if they wanted to have any hopes of salvaging their disastrous 1979 campaign. And even though things seemed like they were going surprisingly well for Cincinnati early on, as they jumped out to a 3-0 lead and were driving in Cowboy territory, everything fell apart after Randy Hughes intercepted Ken Anderson and returned it 62 yards to set the Cowboys up with incredible field position. From there, the floodgates opened up, as that interception was the jumpstart that the Cowboys needed to get the ball rolling. On the very first play following the interception, Dallas capitalized on the good field position, as Scott Laidlaw punched it in from 3 yards out to give the Cowboys a 7-3 lead. And from there, they never relinquished that lead, nor did they ever come close to relinquishing the lead. The Bengals went 3-and-out on their next drive, and the Cowboys once again scored a touchdown, driving down the field to eventually set up a 1-yard touchdown run by Laidlaw for his second score of the day to make it 14-3. And 2 drives later, the Cowboys drove down the field again, thanks to Tony Dorsett doing magical things with the ball in his hands, and thanks to a 3-yard touchdown pass from Roger Staubach to Billy Joe Dupree to cap off the drive. At halftime, the Cowboys are holding on to a 21-6 lead. Considering how dominant they've looked on offense and defense, considering the history of the two teams involved, and considering that this was a 3-possession game back in 1979 because of the absence of the 2-point conversion, let's just say that things were looking very good for the Cowboys in their quest to hold on to this lead at the midway point and improve to 4-1, furthering their quest to tighten their grip on the NFC East. And even though the Bengals made things somewhat interesting, and I use that term very loosely, when they scored on the opening drive of the second half thanks to a 10-yard pass from Ken Anderson to Dan Ross, the second half, much like the first half, belonged to the Cowboys. Dallas immediately answered with a field goal of their own to make it 24-13, and after Anderson threw another interception, with this one going right into the hands of Aaron Mitchell, the Cowboys scored yet again when Staubach threw his second touchdown pass of the day, with this one coming from 9 yards out and going to Tony Hill. The Cowboys were now up 31-13 in the fourth quarter, back up by 3 possessions, and well within position to win this game. So you would think that the drama with this contest is done with the game out of reach, right? Oh no, because as we find out in the broadcasting booth, we were just getting started. What you're about to watch is the play that sparked outrage among just about everyone involved. Because on third down, with the Bengals trying to show any signs of life in the fourth quarter, this happened.
And the one in the third quarter by the rookie Aaron Mitchell stopped some great momentum by Cincinnati as they were coming back.
Oh, is that?
Did he try to one-hand that football?
He certainly did. That thing was dead in his hands, and he tried to catch it with one hand. Well, wait a minute. I don't understand that.
He ought to be fined, if you'll allow me to say it, for having tried to do something like that on a pass that did not necessitate a one-handed catch.
Well, let's see the play first, Sam, before we fine him. Let's see what happens. That was well within his reach. That was well within his reach. No reason to try one hand on that one.
I know he's not happy in Cincinnati and wants to be traded, but that is
very happy about it.
Yeah, the question is, will Paul Brown, Homer Rice, or anybody else say something to Isaac about it?
Well, if they don't, they should.
Apologies for the tape skip in the middle of that, but you get the picture of what Nover was trying to say, as you could point out the words that got cut off. The Cowboys held on and won 38-13, but that was not the story after the game. The story was the fact that play-by-play man Sam Nover and color commentator Bob Trumpy on live television during the broadcast accused Isaac Curtis of loafing it, not because he took a nap on the field Albert Hainsworth style, but because he dropped a pass. Not only that, but they were publicly advocating during a game for the team to fine him and dock his salary even though he was not signed to a contract. Let's just say that when the word got out to the Bengals, and in particular Curtis, about what was said during the game, there was widespread anger across the organization, and especially on the part of Curtis, who took it personally after what Trumpy said about him a month prior. Again, the two men thought that they cleared the air with each other, but apparently not if Trumpy was going to blast him and advocate for the team to lower his paycheck on national television in front of millions of people. And before I talk about the comments, I have to point out one thing. Curtis finished the game with another lackluster performance, where he caught just one pass for 14 yards. However, listen to how the announcers, and in particular Bob Trumpy, talk about Curtis after the catch, because their words there compared to what they said 20 minutes later were like night and day.
From the I formation, Anderson to pass on first down. the 30-yard line. That's the talent that has distinguished Curtis as one of the greatest receivers in the National Football League, something that has been lacking from the Bengals offense in '79.
I agree. I've never seen anybody in professional football with better hands than Isaac Curtis. He's the only guy I've ever seen that can catch the ball when it's passed him. He has that kind of ability, which is hard to understand, but even more difficult to do. They got to keep getting the ball to Isaac Curtis.
When you play that clip, it makes those comments said in the fourth quarter on that drop pass really come out of nowhere. Curtis strongly denied allegations made up in the broadcast booth, saying that what Nover and Trumpy accused him of doing was simply not true. As Curtis said, "I never said anything about getting out of Cincinnati. Even if I was unhappy, I wouldn't let it affect my play. It's a pride thing. I couldn't purposely look bad." And on the drop pass, Curtis said, "I caught sight of it late. It should have been caught. There's no excuse for it." And to be fair to Curtis, everyone else who spoke out about it said the same thing, and said that Curtis wasn't dogging it. His teammate, wide receiver Don Bass, said, "I think he's trying. He's living and dying with the Bengals, just like I do. He's a great receiver, and he'll get his chance to prove it. He's got my vote." Assistant General Manager Mike Brown said, "In the films, you can see he didn't look until late. He didn't see the ball when he should have," as Brown was insistent that Curtis simply misplayed the pass, and it was not for a lack of effort. Brown continued by saying, "It isn't fair to single out a player for our failings as a team. In no way do we feel Isaac Curtis is not giving 100%. And head coach Homer Rice, who was not going to find Curtis as Nover suggested, said what happened is he lost flight of the ball. You could see on the film that his head didn't come around in time. That raises the final and obvious question. How did this whole bizarre saga come to an end?" Let's start with the announcers. Amazingly enough, this incident did not result in any punishment for Nover and Trumpy. The NFL and NBC were more than fine with letting them stay on the air and continue to call games. And they didn't even take them off the Bengals games, because 2 weeks later, they were on the call for the Week 7 matchup between the Bengals and the Steelers, which, to the shock of everyone, the Bengals won 34-10 to snap their 0-6 start to the season. I talked about that game, which might be the most surprising blowout in NFL history, in a previous video of mine. So if you want to learn more about that game, click the card in the upper right corner. I just find it hysterical and laughable how Nover and Trumpy got assigned to 4 more Bengals games that season even after this controversy. If there was ever a time for a valid criticism for a team to file a complaint and request an announcing duo not to call their games, it was this one right here, because you had a broadcaster going on the air and spreading blatant misinformation. Let's just say it wasn't the last time that the Bengals would be infuriated over what happened in the broadcast booth. To learn more about that controversy and Reggie Rucker, click the card in the upper right corner. I should also note one more thing about the Bengals and their fury toward Nover and Trumpy. Even though they got assigned to more games involving the Bengals, it didn't exactly mean that they were welcome in Cincinnati. Nowadays, teams do not do this, but back then, it was incredibly customary for the scoreboard operators to flash a message during the game, welcoming the broadcast booth, welcoming the network, and welcoming the crew to the stadium and to the city. However, when the two men arrived at Riverfront Stadium for that game between the Bengals and the Steelers in Week 7, which was that crazy aforementioned upset that literally no one saw coming, the scoreboard operators refused to show that welcome message. It was not water under the bridge, and the Bengals were not ready to let this display of unprofessionalism go. The team was still fed up with that situation, and understandably so, and this was their way at retaliation and letting them know that their comments were not acceptable. As for Isaac Curtis, he would eventually regain some of his form. Over the final 9 games of the 1979 season, he began to look like his old self, as even though the Bengals were a dumpster fire that season, Curtis finished strong, recording 26 receptions for 531 yards and 8 touchdowns in that stretch. And Curtis never left Cincinnati. In fact, he stayed there all the way until 1984, playing his entire 12-year career with the Bengals, and being a part of the Bengal team that made it to Super Bowl 16. In total, Curtis finished his career with 416 receptions for 7,101 yards and 53 touchdowns. By the time his career in Cincinnati ended, he was the all-time leader by a landslide in receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns. And even though it's been roughly 40 years since he last played and the game has gotten incredibly pass-heavy, he still remains third all-time in franchise history in receiving yards, only behind Chad Johnson and A.J. Green. Many people still consider Isaac Curtis the greatest receiver in Bengals history, as he is a Bengals legend in every sense of the word. But here is a word of advice to announcers in general. Yes, I have no problem with announcers being critical. If there's a bad call on the field, or you don't understand what a coach did, by all means, rip them to shreds and let the viewing audience know about it. But if you're going to go on the air in front of millions of people, don't accuse someone of loafing it and not trying their hardest when, in reality, they just misplayed the football. You come across looking horribly, and it's incredibly unfair to the player in question when his reputation is smeared like that for no reason. Because for a lot of Cowboys fans who never really got the chance to see Curtis play, after this broadcast, they unfairly labeled him as the man who didn't give it his all. Get your official Jaguar Gator 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com, and be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, and subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot. And be sure to check out Twitch every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL trivia and win cash prizes. Link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at Jaguar Gator 9. To see college football videos, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.